When I was a Greenhorn reporter in South Florida in the summer of 2005, I was writing my first stories about hurricanes. Of course, newly out of college and trained, I had just thought about, oh man, it's gonna be so great to cover that just like they do in the national news. Little did I know, when Hurricane Katrina and Wilma hit, it was something I had never prepared for. And I got to witness that firsthand as I experienced this alongside people in my community, the suburban and urban and rural communities of Western Florida. So thinking about this, I saw people who had been climate refugees from other countries come to Florida seeking new lives, working in the orange groves, only to have their lives wiped away before their very eyes. That said, rural communities were not a new thing to me. I'd grown up in several rural communities, and fast forward to 2015 when I came to Appalachia. I started thinking when I moved here to a rural community outside of Johnson City, what is Appalachia and what is its rural identity? And I also started thinking about all the rural communities that I'd lived in before. I remember in 1994 when my parents moved me from Houston, Texas to rural Texas, and what a culture shock I went through because everybody looked and talked a lot like me. I also remembered when I moved during the summers of my college years to small towns of Lolita and Clifton, Texas, and learned how to drive a combine on a sorghum farm. And then I also remembered the times that I lived in the college town of Columbia, Missouri during my PhD, in a place surrounded by Midwestern agriculture, and how people in that community wanted progress, but they also wanted to hold on to the things that were dear to them. In Appalachia, I recognized some of those similar connections to place. And what was consistent, even though they were all very diverse communities, was this idea that people are connected to place. So when I came to Appalachia, I brought with me all of these experiences that I'd had before. And I started thinking, how do I need to deconstruct this? Because we don't want to place any sort of judgment on what it is that we've experienced before. Look at it through a new lens. And so when I came to ETSU in 2019, I started to think about, okay, how can I work with my job and my students to create something that will address these issues in a way that they aren't represented in the national media? So my students and I came together and we created Overlooked in Appalachia, a magazine that's based digitally, and we started to cover things like the opioid epidemic. And we started to think about, okay, how is it as Appalachians we can tell that story in a new way, in a deeper way, and use our Appalachian identity and experience as something to inform what it is that we're examining in a way that the national media hasn't been able to. They cover so many disparities. We have this connection to place that really draws us into a specialty area. And so we created this magazine. We started taking pictures of overlooks and posting them. We started interviewing people that were experiencing the opioid epidemic, people who were on the front lines of the pandemic, diverse religions in the region. And we started doing something more than just representing numbers, right? A lot of us, the information that we get, the news that we get in statistics, right? That's really easy to put out. Health departments put out all sorts of things like this. This is from the CDC, right? And so I really wanted my students to use that knowledge that they had, that insider knowledge, and start to think of things differently. And just like me, they discovered that often the biggest hindrance to telling that story accurately was themselves. And so getting in that space and connecting with people really allowed them to have this opportunity to tell those stories that people might not have had insight into before. At about the same time, in 2019, I started doing a research project where I called journalists, local journalists, and I started interviewing them about what it was that they were experiencing in their news organizations in small towns and rural communities. And I started to see some very interesting trends. And then, of course, right in the middle of that, the pandemic hit. And those things became even clearer, those trends. And so journalists started telling me things like, about how they were doing so much with so little. They had so little resources, and they weren't getting paid a whole lot to do this thing. They were working a lot of hours. But I also noticed that they were a lot more engaged in their communities and unable to remove themselves from their communities. They wanted to be there. They wanted to change the way that people saw what they were experiencing. They were very committed. I joined a rural journalism research group, and since 2019, we've done interviews with over 100 journalists, many of them in this region. And so, one of the things that we found is that these journalists are local people, right? They're people that you'll see at the grocery store. They go to your church, they go to sports games, their kids go to your school. Many of them are dual career. Many of them are teachers, parents, pastors. Many of them are public officials. They run for political office. They're engaged in your community, and they know what's going on. They know who's giving money to charity. They know who pays well, what businesses are trusted, and they make a difference where they are. And that is very central to their identity. They see journalism as a public service. They are not the media. They are local community stakeholders. And so, when we think about this area we live in, we think about Johnson City. Johnson City really has a unique opportunity in that it isn't a place that brings so many places together, right? We have Tennessee, Virginia, West Virginia. We have, North Carolina, all within earshot of where we are. And that positions us in a space to really make a big impact when we do local journalism and we do it well and we invest in our local news organizations. So one of the things, this is a picture of my drive that I make on my commute. And when we're driving across those mountains, I get like 7 different NPR stations. Y'all ever do that? I also don't have any cell phone service for most of my drive. But one of the things that I've noticed in that process is that we are so disconnected from where we are often. We're getting our information from these vast social networks that really don't allow us to connect with each other in the way we should. And local journalists, they're on the ground making those connections for us. I actually see some in the audience today, so this is very exciting. And a lot of those journalists, they are doing things that we don't have the time to do, right? We don't have time to sit around and think through, okay, what comes next? Is this politician lying to me? Is this person telling me misinformation, right? And that's what they're there to do, but there are so few of them. It's a really big challenge. Michael Schudson, who is a scholar in journalism and mass communication, says that memory is created through the channel of distribution. That's kind of an interesting thing to think about. When we get information, it comes to us. That's what makes our memories, right? And Nikki Usher, who's also a scholar in democracy and media, says that if there is local journalists doing local journalism and you're consuming that, that's going to make you more engaged in your local democracy. So what happens when they're not there? What happens when we don't support them? What happens when we're so busy looking at social media feeds that all we care about is the biggest toy unboxing video or the next Walmart fashion trend on our reels, right? Does that help us make a difference? Does that help us vote the right way? Does that help us support our families? Does that help us be kind people? And those journalists are there to remind us of that. And so when I think about social media, right? We all probably have a phone like this that has tons of apps on it. I'm really into Be Real now. It's probably going off right now and I don't have a chance to do it. Somebody in here probably did it, right? We need those people to do that because we can't do it. And journalists have this ability to provide context for us where social media just perpetuates the algorithmic discommunication, misinformation. And if you click on a local news story, that's what you're going to see in your social media feed. So if we don't read it and we don't watch it and we don't consume it, we're not going to see it. And that's so important. When we read local media and we read national media we actually have a really great stringer from the New York Times in this area that does some amazing work about our region, and we put journalists from our region out into those spaces, the narrative changes. Journalists have the power to provide that context. And so I just want to I want to kind of talk about one other concept that I think is really important to think about. So Peggy Abernathy, who's a former journalist and journalism scholar, she coined this term news deserts. Really, I don't really like the term news desert so much. I like to think of it more as news poverty. So what do donuts have to do with that, right? Well, we all love donuts. We just had National Donut Day last week. I could eat donuts every morning, but it's probably not very good for me. So next time you're watching a reel, think about that. Think about, are you getting the information that you really need? Are you getting the information that you want? Maybe you're getting information that you don't need at that time. This is really important when we think about things like the COVID-19 pandemic. So we all got this information, like I showed you from earlier about the opioid epidemic, right? Local journalists were able to bring that to us in a way that was relevant. They created trackers that showed basically down to the county and even sometimes down to the street what the risk was for us. And it really opened a lot of our eyes. Let's not forget about that. But they also brought stories of people that were dealing with this to us, right? We saw that. And we wouldn't have that if local journalists had not risked their lives, had not put themselves in that place. And many of us were not willing to do that. And so, the pandemic may be over, or kind of over, right? We don't have as many cases now, but journalists in crisis and disaster are able to provide that context for us that we might not get otherwise. And since so much of our region is based off disparities, we have to think about how can we take these stories that we experience and share them with the world in a new local, regional, national, and international light. And I believe that local journalists can do that for us. I believe that local journalism, if it's invested in, can take the narrative from destruction to resilience. Thank you.